Hello, this is going to be a reading of Jay Kristoff's book Nevernight. This is the first in the series, and I will be reading this for a very, very special lady that is in my life, and I hope she enjoys this, and I hope everybody else who's listening to this also enjoys this. No shadow without light. Every day follows night. Between black and white, there is gray. Ancient Ashkahi proverb. Caveat emptor. People often shit themselves when they die. Their muscles slack and their souls flutter free, and everything else just slips out. For all their audience's love of death, the playwrights seldom mention it. When our hero breathes his last in his heroine's arms, they call no attraction to the stain leaking across his tights, or how the stink makes her eyes water as she leans in for her farewell kiss. I mention this by way of warning. Oh, my gentle friends, that your narrator shares no such restraint. And if the unpleasant realities of bloodshed turn your insides to water, be advised now that the pages in your hands speak of a girl who was to murder as maestros are to music, who did to happy ever afters what a saw blade does to skin. She's dead herself. Now, words both the wicked and the just would give an eye-teeth smile to hear. A republic in ashes behind her, a city of bridges and bones laid at the bottom of the sea by her hand. And yet, I'm sure she'd still find a way to kill me if she knew I put these words to paper. Open me up and leave me for the hungry dark. But I think someone should at least try to separate her from the lies told about her. Through her, by her. Someone who knew her true. A girl some called Pale Daughter, or Kingmaker, or Crow. But most often nothing at all. A killer of killers, whose tally of endings only the goddess and I truly know. And was she famous or infamous for it at the end? All this death? I confess, I could never see the difference. But then, I've never seen things the way you have. Never truly lived in the world you call your own. Nor did she, really. I think that's why I loved her. Book 1. When All Is Blood. Chapter 1. Firsts. The boy was beautiful. Caramel smooth skin, honeydew sweet smile, black curls on the right side of unruly. Strong hands and hard muscles, and his eyes, oh daughters, his eyes, 5,000 fathoms deep, pulling you in to laugh even as he drowned you. His lips brushed hers, warm and curling soft. They'd stood entwined on the bridge of whispers, a purple blush pressing against the curves of the sky. His hands had roamed her back, current tingling on her skin. The feather-light brush of his tongue against hers set her shivering, heart racing, and side aching with want. They drifted apart like dancers before the music stopped, vibrations still thrumming along their strings. She'd opened her eyes, found him staring back in the smoky light. A canal murmured beneath them, its sluggish flow bleeding out into the ocean, just as she wished to, just as she must, praying she wouldn't drown. Her last Nevernight in the city. A part of her didn't want to say goodbye, but before she left, she'd wanted to know. She owed herself that, at least. "Are you sure?" he asked. She looked up into his eyes then, took him by the hand. "I'm sure," she whispered. The man was repugnant. Solaris's skin, a shallow chin lost in folds of stubbled fat, a sheen of spittle at his mouth, whiskey's kiss scrawled across cheeks and nose, and his eyes, oh daughter, his eyes, blue as the sun's burned sky, glittering like stars in the still true dark. His lips were on the tankard, draining the dregs as the music and laughter swelled about him. He swayed in the taverna's heart a moment longer, then tossed a coin on the iron wood bar and stumbled into the sunlight. His eyes roamed the cobblehead, or bleary with drink. The streets were growing crowded, and he forced his way through the crush, intent only on home and a dreamless sleep. He didn't look up, didn't spy the figure crouched atop a stone gargoyle on a roof opposite, clothed in plaster white and mortar gray. The girl watched him limp away across the bridge of brothers, lifting her harlequin mask to drag on her cigarillo. Clove-scented smoke traveling through the air, The sight of his carrion smile and rope-raw hands set her shivering, heart racing, inside aching with want. Her last Nevernight in the city, a part of her still didn't want to say goodbye. But, before she left, she wanted him to know. She had owed him that at least. A shadow wearing the shape of a cat sat on the roof beside her. It was paper flat and semi-translucent, black as death. Its tail curled around her ankle almost possessively. Cool water seeped out through the city's veins and into the ocean. Just as she wished to. Just as she must. Still praying she wouldn't drown. "Are you sure?" the cat who is shadows asked. The girl watched her mark slink toward his bed, nodded slow. "I'm sure," she whispered. The room had been small, sparse, all she could afford, but she'd set out rose-joy candles and a bouquet of water lilies on clean white sheets. Corners turned down as if to invite him in, and the boy had smiled at the sugar floss sweetness of it all. Walking to the window, she'd stared at the grand old city of God's grave, at white marble and ochre brick and graceful spires kissing the sunburnt sky. To the north, the ribs rose hundreds of feet into the ruddy heavens, tiny windows staring out from apartments carved within the ancient bone. Canals ran out from the hollow spine, their patterns crisscrossing the city's skin like the webs of mad spiders. Long shadows draped the crowded pavements. As the light of second sun dimmed, the first sun long since vanished, leaving their third, sullen red sibling to stand watch through the perils of Nevernight. Oh, if only it had been true dark. If it were, he wouldn't see her. She wasn't sure she wanted him to see her through this. The boy padded up behind her, wreathed in fresh sweat and tobacco, slipping his hands about her waist, fingers running like ice and flame along the divots at her hips. She breathed heavier, tingling somewhere deep and old. Lashes fluttered like butterfly wings against her cheeks as his hand traced the cusp of her navel, dancing across her ribs, up to cup her breasts. Goosebumps prickled on her skin as she breathed into the air, arching her spine, pressing back against the hardness at his crotch, one hand snagged in his unruly locks. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't speak. She didn't want this to begin or end. Turning, sighing as their lips met again, she fumbled with the cufflinks in his ruffled sleeves, all thumbs in sweat and shakes. Pulling their shirts off, she crushed her lips to his, sinking down onto the bed. Just she and he now, skin to skin, her moans or his. She could no longer tell. The ache was unbearable, soaking her through, hands shaking as they explored the wax-smooth swells of his chest, the hard V-shaped line of flesh leading down into his breeches. She slipped her fingers inside and brushed pulsing heat, heavy as iron. Terrifying, dizzying, he groaned, quivering like a newborn colt as she stroked him, sighing around his tongue. She'd never been so afraid, never once in all her 16 years. "Fuck me," she'd breathed. The room was plush, the kind only the wealthiest might afford, yet there were empty bottles on the bureau and dead flowers on the nightstand, wilted in the stale smell of misery. The girl took solace in seeing this man she hated so well to do, and so totally alone. She watched him through the window as he hung up his frock coat, propped a battered tricorn on a dry carafe, trying to convince herself she could do this, that she was hard and sharp as steel. Perched on the rooftop opposite, she looked down on the city of God's grave, on blood-stained cobbles and hidden tunnels and towering cathedrals of gleaming bone. The ribs stabbing the sky above her, twisted canals flowing out from the crooked spine. Long shadows draping the crowded pavements as the second sun grew dimmer still. The first sun long since vanished, leaving their third sullen red sibling to stand watch through the perils of Nevernight. Oh, if it only were true dark. If it were, he wouldn't see her. She wasn't sure she wanted him to see her in this. Reaching out with clever fingers, she pulled the shadows to her, weaving and twisting the black gossamer threads until they flowed across her shoulders, like a cloak. She faded from the world's view, became almost translucent, like a smudge on a portrait of the city's skyline, leaping across the void to his windowsill. She hauled herself up onto the ledge, and swiftly unlocking the glass, she slipped through to the room beyond, soundless as the cat made of shadows following behind. Sliding a stiletto from her belt, she breathed heavier, tingling somewhere deep and old, crouched unseen in a corner, lashes fluttering like butterfly wings against her cheeks. She watched him filling a cup with quavering hands. She was breathing too loudly, her lessons all a tumble in her head, but he was too numb to notice. Lost somewhere in the remembered creaks of 1,000 stretched necks, 1,000 pair of feet dancing on the nooseman's tune. Her knuckles turned white on the dagger's hilt as she watched from the gloom. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't speak. She didn't want this to begin or end. He sighed as he drank from the cup, fumbling with cufflinks on ruffled sleeves, all thumbs in sweat and shakes. Pulling his shirt off, he limped across the boards and sank down onto the bed. Just she and he now, breath for breath. Her end or his, she could no longer tell. The pause was unbearable, sweat soaking her through as the darkness shivered, remembering who she was, what this man had taken, all that would unravel if she failed. And steeling herself, she threw off her cloak of shadows and stepped out to meet him. He gasped, starting like a newborn colt as she walked into the red sunlight, a harlequin's smile in place of her own. She'd never seen anyone so afraid, not once in all her 16 years. "Fuck me," he breathed. He climbed atop her, breeches around his ankles, his lip on her neck and her heart in her throat. An age passed, somewhere between wanting and fearing and loving and hating, and then she'd felt him, hot and astonishingly hard, pressing against the softness between her legs. She drew breath, perhaps to speak, but what would she say? And then there was pain. Pain. Oh, daughters. It hurt. He was inside her. It was inside her. So hard and real she couldn't help but cry out, biting her lip to muffle the flood. He'd been heedless, careless. Weight pressed down on her as he thrust again and again. Nothing like the sweet imaginings she'd filled this moment with. Her legs splayed and her stomach knotted, kicking against the mattress and wanting him to stop. To wait. Was this the way it should feel? Was this the way it should be? If all went awry later, this would be her last Nevernight in the world, and she'd known the first was usually the worst. She'd thought herself ready, soft enough, wet enough, wanting enough. That everything the other street girls had said between the giggles and the knowing glances wouldn't be true for her. "Close your eyes," they'd counsel. "It'll be over soon enough." But he was so heavy, and she was trying not to cry, and she wished this wasn't the way it had to be. She dreamed of this, hoped it's some kind of special, but now she was here. She thought it a stumbling, clumsy affair. No magic or fireworks or bliss by the handful, just the press of him on her chest, the ache of him thrusting away. Her eyes closed as she gasped and winced and waited for him to be done. He pressed his lips to hers, fingers cupping her cheeks, and in that moment there was a flicker of it, a sweetness to set her tingling again, despite the awkwardness and breathlessness and hurtingness of it all. She kissed him back, and there was heat inside her, flooding and filling as every muscle went taut, and he pressed his face into her hair and shuddered through his little death, finally collapsing atop her, soft, damp, and boneless. Lying there, she breathed deep, licked his sweat from her lips, sighed. He rolled away, crumpled on the sheets beside her. Reaching between her legs, she found wetness, aching, smeared on fingertips and thighs, on clean white linen with the corners turned down as if to invite him in. Blood. "Why didn't you tell me this was your first?" he asked. She said nothing, staring at the red gleaming at her fingertips. "I'm sorry," he whispered. She looked at him, then looked away just as quickly. "You've nothing to be sorry for." She was atop him, knees pinning down, his hand on her wrist, and her stiletto at his throat. An age passed, somewhere between struggling and hissing and biting and begging, and finally the blade sank home, sharp and so astonishingly hard, sinking through his neck and scraping his spine. He drew sucking breath, perhaps to speak, but what could he say? And she could see it in his eyes. Pain. Pain. Oh, daughters, it hurt. It was inside him. She was inside him, stabbing hard as he tried to cry out, her hand over his mouth to muffle the flood. He was panicked, desperate, scrabbling at her mask as she twisted the blade. Nothing like the dreadful imaginings she'd filled the moment with. His legs splayed and his neck gushing, kicking against the mattress and wanting her to stop, to wait. Is this the way it should feel? Is this the way it should be? If all had gone awry, this would have been her last Nevernight in this world, and she knew the first was usually the worst. She thought she wasn't ready, not strong enough, not cold enough. That old Mercurio reassurances wouldn't be true for her. Remember to breathe, he'd counseled. It'll be over soon enough. He was thrashing and she was holding him still, and everything about her wondered if this was the way it would always be. She imagined this moment might feel like some kind of evil. A tithe to be paid, not a moment to be savored. But now she was here. She thought it beautiful, a balletic affair. His spine arching beneath her, the fear in his eyes as he tore her mask aside, the gleam of the blade she'd thrust home, hand over his mouth as she nodded and shushed with a mother's voice, waiting for him to be done. He clawed her cheek, the vile reek of his breath and shit filling the room, and in that moment there was a flicker of it, a horror giving birth to mercy, despite the fact that he deserved this ending, and 100 more. Drawing back her blade, she buried it in his chest, and there was heat on her hands, flooding and sluicing as his every muscle went taut, and he grasped her knuckles and sighed through his death, deflating beneath her, soft and damp and boneless. Sitting atop him, she breathed deep, tasted salt and scarlet, sighed. She rolled away, crumpled sheets around her. Touching her face, she found wetness, warmth, smeared on her hands and lips. Blood. "Hear me, Nia," she whispered. "Hear me, mother. This flesh your feast, this blood your wine, this life, this end, my gift to you. Hold him close." The cat whose shadows watched from its perch on the bedhead, watched her the way only the eyeless can. It said not a word. It didn't need to. Muted sunlight on her skin, raven hair, damp with sweat and hanging in her eyes. She pulled up leather breeches, tossed a mortar gray shirt over her head, tucking the wolfskin boots. Sore, stained, but glad in it. Somehow. Somewhere near content. "The room is paid up for the Nevernight," she'd said, "if you want it." The sweet boy had watched from the other side of the bed, head on his elbow. "And my coin?" She motioned to a purse beside the looking-glass. "You're younger than my usuals," he'd said. "I don't get many firsts." She looked at herself in the mirror then, pale skin and dark eyes, younger than her years. And though evidence to the contrary lay drying on her skin, for a moment she still found it hard to think of herself as anything more than a girl. Something 16 years in this city had never managed to temper. She pushed her shirt back into her breeches, checked the harlequin mask in her cloak, the stiletto at her belt, gleaming and sharp. The hangman would be leaving the tavern soon. "I have to go," she said. May I ask you something, Midona?" "Ask then." "Why me? Why now?" "Why not?" That's no kind of answer. You think I should have saved myself? Is that it? That I'm some gift to be given, now forever spoiled?" The boy said nothing, watching her with those fathom-deep eyes, pretty as a picture. The girl drew a cigarello from a silver case, lit it in one of the candles, breathing deep. "I just wanted to know what it was like," she finally said, "in case I die." She shrugged, exhaled gray. "Now I know." And into the shadows she walked. Muted sunlight on her skin, mortar gray cloak flowing down her shoulders, rendering her a shadow in the sullen light. She stood beneath a marble arch in the Beggar's King's piazza, the third sun hanging faceless in the sky. Memories of the hangman's end drying in the bloodstains on her hands. Memories of the sweet boy's lips drying with the stains on her breeches. Sore, sighing, but still glad in it, somehow. Still somewhere near content. "Didn't die, I see." Old Mercurio watched her from the other side of the arc, tricorn pulled low, cigarillo at his lips. "He seems smaller somehow, thinner, older." "Not for lack of trying," the girl replied. She looked at him then, stained hands and fading eyes, old beyond his years, and though evidence to the contrary was crusting on her skin, for a moment she found it hard to think of herself as anything more than a girl. Something weak and shivering, something 6 years in his tutelage had never managed to temper. "I won't see you for a long time, will I?" she asked. "I might never see you again." "You knew this," he said. "You chose this." "I'm not sure there was ever a choice," she said. She opened her fist, a sheepskin purse in her palm. The old man took the offering, counting the contents with one ink-stained finger, clinking, blood-stained. 27 teeth. Seems the hangman lost a few before I got to him, she explained. Mercurio tossed the teeth back to the girl. Be at the 17th pier by 6 bells. A Dwemery brigantine called Trelline's Bow. She's a free ship, not flying under Itrian colors. She'll bear you hence. Oh, nowhere you can follow. I've trained you well. This is for you alone. Cross the red church threshold before the first turn of Septimus, or you will never cross it at all. I understand. Affection gleamed in rheumy eyes. You're the greatest pupil I've ever sent into the mother's service. You'll spread your wings in that place and fly, and you will see me again. She drew the stiletto from her belt, proffered it on her forearm. Head bowed. The blade was crafted of grave bone, gleaming white and hard as steel, its hilt carved like a crow in flight. Red amber eyes gleamed in the scarlet sunlight. Keep it, the old man sniffled. It's yours again. You earned it, at last. She looked the knife over, this way and that. Should I give it a name? You could, I suppose, but what's the point? It's this bit. She touches the blade's tip. The part you stick them with. Oh, bravo! Mind you don't cut yourself on a wit that sharp. Mercurio took back the dagger, held it up between them. Naming your blade is the sort of faff reserved for heroes, girl. Men who have songs sung about them, history spun for them, brats named after them. It's the Shadow Road for you and me, and you dance it right. No one will ever know your name, let alone the pig sticker in your belt. You'll be a rumor, a whisper, the thought that wakes the bastards of this world sweating in the Nevernight. The last thing you'll ever be in this world, girl, is someone's hero. Mercurio handed back the blade. But you will be a girl heroes fear. She smiled, suddenly and terribly sad. She hovered a moment, leaned in close, gifted sandpaper cheeks with a gentle kiss. I'll miss you, she said, and into the shadows she walked.